Well, good morning to each of our attendees. We're glad that you're here, and thank you for taking the time to attend the Global Home Education Conference session that is entitled "Home-Based Learning: A Solution to Education in a Pandemic." I'm thrilled to be here with a distinguished panel, and my name is Gerald Huebner. I'm from Canada, and it's great to be here with our panel from a number of places, and we'll introduce them as we go along. But I'd just like to remind everyone that this session is being recorded, and it will be available for you to look at and to view later. To those that are watching this as a recording, we welcome you as well. And we, as the Global Home Education Exchange Council, have a purpose of advancing, equipping, and connecting home education leaders and those that are involved in policy and research from around the world. You can get more information on the Global Home Education Council on our website, which is GHEX, www, like usual, .ghex.world. And at that, you'll find a lot of the information from this conference as well as past conferences that you can access, and we would encourage you to do that. Without a lot of further discussion, our session here today is looking at the world that we're in today. The global pandemic has upset the daily rhythm of each of our lives and heavily impacted public education, and governments have attempted to deliver education through a variety of methods, including online learning. How has homeschooling been a solution to the pandemic? That's our question for today. The options of blended, hybrid, fully online, fully offline. How are families, education systems, and policymakers coping with that? That's really what we've asked our panelists to talk about here today. And we certainly also want to look at and not forget the economic consequences of the pandemic, which without question will be significant on state budgets as well as individuals, the families, the impacts that are there. How are the systems and the policymakers coping with that? And I think one of the other things that we want to look at is how will all of this impact the increase in home education around the world, and what lessons have policymakers applied, and what can they apply from this experience, because we're not over yet. I know that in the province where I live and in parts of Canada, there's discussion again about the potential of schools closing in the coming days. Many are now open or have blended programs, but there's potential with recent surges to look at the potential of further impacts and closing. So we're not done yet, and these lessons are ones that are being applied regularly and constantly. I want to welcome our first speaker here today, and what we'll be doing is each speaker will be taking about 15 minutes or so to speak to us and to review things from their perspective. And our first speaker is Kerry McDonald. Kerry comes to us from the United States. She's a senior education fellow with the FEE, which is the I'm trying to remember I've seen it a number of times, and I'll ask Kerry to speak to it. She's the author of a number of articles, Unschooled, Raising Curious and Well-Educated Children. Kerry has been involved in a number of our GHEX seminars before. She was very involved in a forum that happened back in the spring. Kerry is from Massachusetts, and she home educated along with her husband their 4 children. And Kerry, I'd like to welcome you here today and just point out that if anybody wants to visit her website and learn more about what she does, you can do that at fee.org/Kerry and follow her on Twitter as well. So Kerry, welcome here today. Welcome back. I know that you've been involved in a number of the sessions at GHEX, and we're so glad that you could join us for this session on home-based learning, a solution to education in the pandemic.
Oh, thank you, Gerald. I'm delighted to be here. Yes, it's FEE.org, the Foundation for Economic Education, based in the US, but a global reach. Yeah, we are in a transformative moment, certainly in American education, certainly here in America, and I think globally as well. At the peak of the pandemic last spring, and of course, Gerald's right, we might be getting to another peak now, but certainly last spring, we had over 50 million US K-12 school children suddenly finding themselves crisis homeschooling or pandemic homeschooling as their schools shut down. Globally, of course, it was around 1.3 billion school children that were learning from home suddenly as a result of school closures during the pandemic. And, I think that this is certainly what is leading to a lot of the transformation in American education and in global education. Even as schools reopen, the pandemic is still with us. And I think it's really causing certainly parents to think a little bit more broadly about some of their options. Now, of course, those of us who've homeschooled authentically our children under typical times know that what families encountered last spring was nothing like genuine homeschooling. We were all, of course, disconnected from our communities, from the people, places, and things around us that make homeschooling under normal conditions so rewarding and fulfilling. And of course, we were all separated from our communities back in the spring. So it was hard on regular homeschoolers as well as these sort of newcomers into the world of home-based learning. But that's why, I think I was really surprised when one of the first polls came out looking at trying to gauge the experiences of families going through this pandemic homeschooling, all of the disruption to their lives, to their work, to their schooling and learning. One of the first surveys was in April. It was conducted by EdChoice, and it revealed that more than half of the parents surveyed in their sample reported more favorable views toward homeschooling than they had prior to the pandemic. And again, this was not what we would think of as typical homeschooling. In many cases, it was really just school at home, remote learning tied to the district, which was very clunky and not at all well thought out because it was so sudden. But even still, families were starting to say, gee, this isn't so bad. And that, was, I think, a hopeful sign of what was to come. The following month, a Real Clear Opinion research survey, basically found the same thing. More parents were more satisfied with at-home learning than they expected. 40% of them in this poll saying they were more likely to choose homeschooling or virtual learning even after the lockdowns ended. That would have been this fall, but they were reporting this last May. And then around the same time, USA Today Ipsos poll found that 60% of parents surveyed said they would likely choose at-home learning this fall rather than send their kids to school, even if schools reopened for in-person learning. So, there were these trends of parents saying, gee, this wasn't so bad. Maybe my kids are actually learning more at home. Maybe I'm getting a peek for the first time at what my kids are actually learning in their classrooms or are not learning in their classrooms. And they might have felt a little more bold to be able to take the reins themselves. I think the other thing that the fact that so many parents found themselves working from home, a trend that, for example, the Brookings Institution expects to continue long after the pandemic ends, has changed the relationship for many families between work and school and home, maybe making it more possible for more families to choose home education. So over the summer, a lot of these polling predictions became reflected in actual parental behavior. Parents began officially pulling their children out of school, certainly here in the US, and registering them as homeschoolers. During the first week in July, for example, so many parents registered their intent to homeschool online in North Carolina that it crashed the state's education website. Just so much interest there. They are seeing, skyrocketing rates of homeschooling there. And we're seeing similar trends all around. In Nebraska, for example, in July, NPR reporting that homeschool applications were up 21% over last year. In Vermont, up 75%. And, certainly this was confirmed by a lot of grassroots homeschooling networks and Facebook groups that were seeing record increases in parents saying, what do I do now? I want to homeschool. Where do I go? And what do I do? So, certainly seeing a lot of parental behavior there. And then an August Gallup poll found that the rate of parents saying they would homeschool this academic year had doubled from last year to 10% of families saying they would choose independent homeschooling. And the Gallup poll was particularly helpful because it was written such that it said that parents were pulling their children out of a school, whether a private school or a district school, for independent homeschooling. So it tried to make the distinction between this pandemic homeschooling or still registered with your school district, but doing school at home remotely, and truly independent homeschooling with the freedom and flexibility that entails. And that, again, finding a 10% of respondents saying they would be homeschooling this year. This also included an associated drop in public school enrollment, according to the Gallup poll, saying that the number of parents sending their children to an assigned district school was down 7% over last year to 76% of K-12 students in the US, one of the lowest rates that we've ever had. So that was interesting. Current data also showing again this fall, now that the school year has officially started, seeing that these polls were again correct, that parental behavior was reflected in these polls. NPR, for example, recently reporting massive public school enrollment drops in at least 20 states. I think the data that I've pulled up suggests that there's even more than 20 states seeing massive public school enrollment drops, more so than in decades, and an associated climb in homeschooling numbers. So record homeschoolers this year, pulling children out of their district school for independent homeschooling. Just this week, Education Week reported that an estimate that 9% of K-12 US school children are homeschooled this year. That would be a bump from typically around 3.5%, according to federal data pre-pandemic. So, I think this is all showing us that parents are really taking charge of their children's education and perhaps, again, getting a better sense of what their children are learning, what they're not learning, and saying, maybe we can do things better. Now, certainly, I think when the pandemic ends, there will be a lot of parents who will say, well, that was an interesting experience. Now I'm ready to send my kid back to school. But I think we will certainly continue to see this bump in homeschooling numbers as parents realize just the assortment of resources available to them, not only online, but when communities open up again, being able to see those rich homeschooling networks, in-person learning opportunities, co-ops, and so on, that their children be able to take advantage of. And I think that they'll want to stay. I talked to a lot of families last spring who said, gee, I've always been thinking about homeschooling, been curious about homeschooling, but I lacked that catalyst. I lacked that inertia to make it happen. And the pandemic provided this opportunity to give it a try, to see what homeschooling really would be like. And so, at least several families that I spoke to said this was my chance to pull my kid officially out of school, where so many school districts really had a hard time navigating to remote learning, and now allow my children the opportunity for independent homeschooling. So I think we'll see a little bit more of that, more families deciding to stick with this. Another interesting trend that appeared over the summer that I think is also here to stay potentially, and I'm sure Corey will talk a little bit more about this in his session, is the pandemic pod trend. This term sort of came on the scene, I believe, in early July. Families figuring out that they didn't want to have isolated pandemic homeschooling like they had in the spring. They wanted to gather in small, safe groups of children, families, multi-age in many cases, to allow their children to learn together, whether that was independent homeschooling, what we would sort of think of as a co-op of families getting together and allowing their children to learn, with parents taking turns, facilitating a curriculum, or pooling resources to hire an instructor, or just gathering together as a group of children to do the remote schooling as a small group, again, rather than being so isolated as they were in the spring. And this trend really skyrocketed. It started with some Facebook groups of parents saying, anyone else want to form a pod? And then it's really just exploded, certainly here in the US. Of course, along with that have come calls for regulating these pandemic pods. There's been state guidelines in several states of what these pods can look like. Typically, again, though, that regulation applies to parents who are maintaining their connection to the school district, and more freedom and flexibility, certainly for families who leave the district for independent homeschooling, but something, certainly we need to be watchful for. I think something that HSLDA has always been vigilant about, making sure that that regulation, increased regulation, does not hit homeschoolers. But along with this sort of increased regulation of these pandemic pods for these pandemic homeschooling families, there's been some trends towards deregulation that I think could be helpful. Again, not only for families choosing alternatives to school now and later after the pandemic, but also potentially for homeschoolers. I know, I'm here in Boston, Massachusetts, and I know in Massachusetts, along with increased regulation of these pandemic pods, there were some hopeful signs of deregulation, such as allowing after-school programs to be able to provide daytime school time programming for pandemic pod families. And so that's something that I think would be a good sign if that stays and allows an expansion of learning resources for homeschoolers even after the pandemic. So that's a good sign as well. I think another trend that we've seen over the past several months that could be good for homeschoolers, again, during the pandemic, whether they're temporary homeschoolers or after the pandemic ends, is just the explosion in education entrepreneurship during the pandemic. The Wall Street Journal recently had an analysis showing that Americans are starting new businesses at the fastest rate in more than a decade. So just during the pandemic, enormous entrepreneurship, many people starting new businesses, not necessarily making up for all the businesses that have been lost during the pandemic, but certainly a positive sign that there are these innovative and creative entrepreneurs who are trying to meet new demand during the pandemic. And we're seeing this certainly in the education sector, as well as many other places. I recently wrote an article for fee.org about the increase in education entrepreneurship that I think is beneficial to homeschoolers as well. For example, there is an online learning program started by Michael Strong, who's a longtime entrepreneur who's worked with a lot of homeschoolers in the past. And he started a new remote learning program called Expanse, which is currently aimed at middle school and high school students, but really high quality remote learning. And so again, not quite independent homeschooling, but something that could attract families who may be homeschooling now, or maybe sort of in between two worlds of their remote schooling tied to their district, but really wanting to homeschool and needing some more support there. So, I think there's some opportunity. I also, in this particular article, interviewed an entrepreneur from Washington, D.C., who was planning to open a homeschool resource center in person this fall to really provide a lot of opportunities for D.C. homeschoolers. Of course, the pandemic hit. She had to pivot to providing this as sort of an online program only, which was difficult, challenging for her. But she said one of the bright spots is that now, because there are so many more people who are finding themselves in the position of homeschooling this fall, she has more demand for her program, even though it's not quite what she originally envisioned in terms of an in-person model, and is hoping going forward to have sort of these multiple options of in-person as well as some digital resources as well. So just interesting to see that. I think also, certainly with the pandemic pod movement and on a micro level, a lot of educators finding that they could make more money and have more flexibility as a tutor or as a facilitator of some of these pandemic pods. I spoke with one high school English teacher in Illinois who had previously made about $49,000 as a public school English teacher, realized during the summer that she could make more money and have more flexibility being an English tutor and helping out with some of these pandemic pods in her area. And so we're seeing even on that micro level, some of these solopreneurs or individual educators being able to serve families and meet the demand for some of these alternatives to school. So, I think in addition to these emerging innovations, we'll see also a greater demand for education choice policies going forward to allow more families to access a lot of these alternatives to school. Corey may touch on this a little bit more as well. Here in the US, we currently spend over $700 billion every year on K-12 schooling. And, there's a lot of thought that particularly now as many schools are closed or shut down and families can't access those services, that money really should follow the family and go to the child as opposed to being really ensnared in these public school bureaucracies. So I think we'll see a greater push for education choice mechanisms that allow families a much more expanded options. I'll just sort of end with talking a little bit about why I think this is a transformative moment and maybe some parallels to some earlier disruptions. Back in 2019, Stanford's Terry Moe wrote a book called The Politics of Institutional Reform, where he looked at the impact of Hurricane Katrina, which was a massive hurricane that hit New Orleans, Louisiana in 2005, really devastated the city and completely uprooted the entire education system, but broke down a lot of these institutional controls, these bureaucratic mechanisms that were really entrenched and prevented any kind of innovation or change in the district. So that now New Orleans is almost entirely a public charter school system. It's almost an all charter school system in New Orleans. Really something that at least Terry Moe argues couldn't really have happened without that large scale change, external force that led to these bureaucratic policies and systems being disrupted. And I think we'll see a similar pattern as a result of the pandemic. In this case, though, I think it's actually even more parent-driven, that I think that it's a much more decentralized process now, particularly, again, where you see so many families who really took charge of their children's education, said, we are not happy with this remote learning. These districts keep opening and then shutting down again. There's so much uncertainty, or just the social distancing and pandemic response that are in classrooms right now. A lot of families saying, that's not how I want my child learning. And so I think we've seen incredible parental empowerment during this pandemic. And I think similar to, again, the Hurricane Katrina situation in New Orleans, it will lead to long-lasting change in American education that's really decentralized, spontaneous in terms of families getting together and creating new initiatives or creating new models for learning. And I think homeschooling will be, definitely see an uptick going forward and will really be the model from which a lot of these new education alternatives sprout.
Kerry, thank you. Really appreciate your fascinating presentation. I think the focus and the discussion that is happening on educational reforms, it's amazing how it's being driven up. The increase in discussion with parents who, in some cases, I think have been their eyes have been opened in terms of their own children's education when they sort of looked over their shoulder at some of the online learning, which isn't necessarily the full illustration of what's happening in the various systems, but it gave them some insights that they hadn't had before. And I think all of that is serving to increase the discussion and the focus on education change and education policy. So thank you for your comments in bringing us to what does this all mean for us in the home education movement. I'd like to continue and to move along with our next speaker, which is Angela da Silva. Angela is from Brazil, and is currently serving as the National Secretary of the Family and in the Ministry at the Ministry of Women, Family, and Human Rights of Brazil. Angela has a law degree and has been involved in the whole area of law and policy at a very significant level. Has worked as a visiting professor and researcher at Harvard. Has graduate degrees from the University of Sao Paulo and a doctor's degree in philosophy from the Federal University at Rio Grande do Sul. We welcome Angela. She's actually, I think, is it Portugal? Where you are at this point, Angela. We appreciate your taking the time as you are involved in things around the world to come and to speak to us about home-based learning, a solution to education in the pandemic. And we just welcome you here as you're able to spend time with us here today. So welcome here.
Angela, you're on
you need mute. To unmute yourself, Angela. Your microphone is on mute.
Yeah. Is that okay?
We got you. Now we got you. Welcome.
So I'm so happy to be with you, Mike. And well, hello to everyone. So happy to be here. I'm in Poland, and we are fighting for life here, for against abortion and to promote life, and also women and women's rights, and defending real human rights. And now I was in another meeting in the Ministry of Justice and talking about the best interest for the child. And I thought about this best interest of the child in homeschooling too. That's what we finding out in Brazil. We still don't have this right to homeschool. We are fighting so hard from the Ministry of Human Rights, Women, Family, and Human Rights, but we see that the parents want the best for the child, and sometimes we don't let them do that in the best of interest of their children. So I just want to share a little bit of this right, and you know that we're fighting for that, and proves that it shows all over the world. We can have evidences, and I saw that in the United States and the countries in OECD too, that the children departing from homeschooling, they have a much better performance. Even at Harvard, I found so many good pupils over there, students that were homeschooled, and they were there, and we have to go for these evidences and show and share these evidences, like entering the university from homeschooling, because we want to show that it's incredible. In Brazil, we have this practice, and when we see these children departing from this practice, we see how good educated, how well educated they are. Even in common education, even saying, thank you, please. They are excellent in this human education too, but even with evidences, they are not accepting that. Well, still, the Supreme Court says it's a constitutional right, and they agree, but they want the Congress, the National Congress, to say yes, and to have a law for that. And it's 26 years. There are projects of law, there are statutes to be approved, and they don't go for it. They don't go. And now we are going for the president of the National Congress to bring this back, all these projects together, and find the best one to approve till the end of the year. Our ministry is fighting for this, for the families, but still he didn't decide himself if he's going to bring this topic or not. While that the COVID brought this up, No, it has awakened people to see that they are able to homeschool. And lots of parents are saying, no, I'm going to change. I'm going to homeschool, because I could see that even I learn with that, with my children. And it's a way of strengthening family bonds too, no? Bonds. So I think COVID helped us to show that people are able to homeschool and they want it, no? And at the same time, we have to say that we are supporting homeschooling, especially because it's freedom, because it's a human right, and Brazil, they fear about, well, if we transform everything in homeschooling, the schools are going to disappear. And there's a lot of commerce, I can tell you, in education. Brazil has a problem of commerce in education, because it's a way of earning money, no? And even we pay taxes to educate children. We're going now in the tax reform. We say that you should help us to educate, not no, we pay taxes because of education. This is ridiculous. This should be a target, you know, to help even parents in homeschooling with well, taxes and everything. So we're going for that in the Ministry of Economics too. But they fear that the schools are going to disappear. We don't have this problem. We don't think like parents are all going to homeschool. But we have to say that it's freedom. We can see that it's an excellent system, and we have to support it. Even from the Ministry of Education, we are working with them, and the minister right now, he accepts that, and he's going with us to the Parliament to defend. But it's not easy, I can tell you, because of politics, because of our tradition. Something that happened for 14 years in Brazil, there was the leftist regime that took the child from the family, no, and gave it to the state, and is the state who like protects the child, the state who knows what's better for them. And I was in another event with a person that worked for the government and prepared people to enter the public schools, and there in their like knowledge was written like what are the duties the state have towards the child, to educate, to whatever, protect and everything, and what are the duties of the parents, to have the inscription at school, and only that. Can you believe that? So it's ridiculous to say that. I said, how can the responsible for the children? Our Constitution says that are the parents, and also the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So we have to show that and practice that too, no? So we're going for this to change this way of seeing the child as like protected by the state and educated by the state. We have to give platform for the families to have voice and to choose whatever they think is better for their children, and with freedom too. Because the problem now at the National Congress is that they want to, okay, we're going to give this right, but we're going to give this right with lots of demands, like you have to come every 6 months. We have to follow you up. We have to. No. You want to give freedom and freedom. That's it. No, and we just once a year we're planning that once a year. You bring your child, and we see if it's growing. But we have to give freedom, giving freedom to them to whatever they want, and we don't want to suffocate the families with lots of rules in homeschooling. We don't think this is right, but there's the discussion. Okay, we're going to give the system, but we're going to follow it up. No interference. We want the parents to be real free and really to show in some years what happened. No, these children are going to be at university and also educated and not manipulated, because 2 days ago I went to the Supreme Court in the name of the families to say that they are about to approve ideology of gender as a right at school, without the interference of parents. Parents are not able to say anything because it's going to be a crime. No, so we say no. Don't do that. Don't do that. The parents are freaking out about that. How are you going to implement this ideology of gender at school? So sometimes parents are scared because we have lots of denounces about what's going on at school with this ideology of gender or whatever education, sexual comprehensive sexuality education that they're already having at schools in Brazil. So and we're going to see that we're going to have like after some years, children or adolescents or teenagers or students like high school students much more balanced, much more prepared for a relationship or whatever. And I can tell you something, we also working on suicide and self-harming, and we can see that there's a lot of frustration in adolescents and even children now that are self-harming themselves because of these problems departing from comprehensive sexuality education or not having an education at all, because they waste time at school, not this year, but and they have topics that has nothing to do with education. They're not prepared to enter university, and so we know that our education system is not good. No, so we have to go for that, showing also that there are other ways of educating, and we're going to see the fruits of homeschooling in some years. We can already see, but the parents are hidden because they can be suited because of homeschooling. And thanks be to God, the COVID was a tragedy, but it brought three things in our secretariat. First of all, to see that people are able to homeschool and they liked it. The second thing is like that a mom can have home office and can also be a mom and have be productive in her work. So home office showed itself as a good means to work and balance the family and work. The third thing is intergenerational solidarity, and also the family got together, because of COVID, and they discovered their relationships, the real relationships, instead of, always virtual or always technologically. So there are things that we learn from this pandemic, and hopefully we're not gonna forget. And we have now to implement these consequences. We had like this human consequences, good human consequences from this pandemic. There are good lessons, and we have to implement now as quick as possible. So I truly ask you to give a support to Brazil, whatever you can do to support all our activism to fight for homeschooling as a human right. And also as soon as we can do that, and now we still please share experiences and share what you have in your countries, so that we can show to the Supreme Court, to the National Congress, how how, fruitful is to homeschool. And one thing is good too, that lots of parents that they delegate children to school, and they have a clear omission in educating. When they see the effort of parents, homeschoolers, they say, no, what are we doing for our children? So you give a great example. And I truly learn. Whenever I'm with children homeschooled, I learn from they are so dedicated. They well brought. They are so smart. It's incredible. So it's just because they don't want to see that, because they want to keep on manipulating children, sometimes at public schools, and also because this is all about money, I can tell you, because they fear of wasting money because on education, and this is why they don't leave us ideology, and also economic interests that are not the best interest for the child. That's what I had to say. I have to go to another event now.
Angela, thank you.
Thank you, Angela.
Angela, we so much appreciate your message of encouragement, of hope, and of, I think, reason in looking at what are the impacts. It's not easy, but you've shared with us the reality of a breath of fresh air from Brazil, a breath of reason and logic that I think will be an encouragement to legislators, to leaders, and to families around the world. And I thank you for your message today.
Thank you for being around with us. Mike, thank you for your support, and congratulations to you all for this event. Kerry, I loved your talk. It was great. The only one I could watch until now, but congratulations.
Angela, thank you so much. You are busy National Secretary representing Brazil all over the world, and we are so grateful for your support to the homeschooling community in Brazil, but also globally. I know that you are an advocate, and you've seen it in the United States when you lived here. You've seen it in Brazil, and thank you so much for helping us. We will help you, and we appreciate you helping.
Please.
Have a wonderful
Goodbye,
afternoon.
people.
Goodbye.
Thank you. I have to leave. So sorry. I would love to stay, but anyways, I have another meeting right now.
We understand.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you, Angela, and we will continue on with our program. Next on our list of speakers, back again, is Corey DeAngelis. Corey's been on a number of workshops, and a number of you have already heard from Corey, and I just want to welcome him back. Corey is the Director of School Choice at the Reason Foundation and an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute. He's also the Executive Director of the Education Freedom Institute, and his research primarily focuses on the effects of school choice programs on non-academic outcomes such as criminal activity, character skills, mental health, and political participation. He's authored and co-authored 40 different journal articles, book chapters, and reports on educational policy, and his research has been published in peer-reviewed academic journals that are many. Corey, we really appreciate being able to hear from you again and have you share from your perspective as a researcher looking at education. And our topic is home-based learning, a solution to education in a pandemic. Corey, over to you.
Hey, thank you so much for the kind introduction, Gerald, and thanks to Angela and Kerry for the great presentations. I will say my work is mostly on school choice. If you want to see some of my arguments as it pertains to school choice, check out my new co-edited book with Cato Institute's Neil McCluskey, School Choice Myths, Setting the Record Straight on Education Freedom. I do some work on homeschooling as well. For example, one of my latest articles with Angela Dills from Western Carolina University, we found that compulsory education laws in the United States were associated with reductions in innovation and productivity, which implies that homeschooling could improve, home-based education could improve creative thinking and innovation. If you want to check out one of my recent studies, it's in Social Science Quarterly. I agree with a lot of the things that were said by the previous speakers, pretty much most of the things that were said, especially with Kerry. I think we have all of the same stats, Kerry. We're both from the United States. One of the stats that I didn't know about was the Education Week stat. You had the latest information about 9% of families who weren't homeschooling before now saying that they're going to homeschool this year. So I actually just tweeted about it when you were doing your presentation, when I looked up the statistic. And I agree with Angela too, that I believe that one of the only silver linings of the pandemic is that people got to test drive some form of home-based education, which Kerry calls crisis homeschooling. And a lot of families found out that they liked it. And I think this is going to be a long-term trend towards more people homeschooling, since the people who found out that they didn't like homeschooling during this test drive, well, they weren't homeschooling anyway. So they'll just, worst case scenario is they go back to the old way of doing things and they go back to the formal school system. But I feel like a lot of people started to figure out that that they needed to rethink the factory model of schooling. A lot of parents were reporting that their children were less anxious, that they were getting more work done at a fraction of the time, and that that their children were just more interested in what was going on because the work was more student driven, as opposed to in the school where the child is told what they must be interested in every second of the day, and they essentially don't have any autonomy in the formal school setting, even in a lot of private schools. So I think a lot of families figured that out. As Kerry said, EdChoice did one of the first surveys on this, asking parents, how has the COVID-19 pandemic affected your views on homeschooling? Are you now more favorable towards homeschooling, or are you less favorable towards homeschooling? And as Kerry said, parents were, the majority of parents responded that they were more favorable when it came to homeschooling and their views on homeschooling. And they were over twice as likely to say that they were more favorable than they were to say that they were less favorable as it came to homeschooling. And also over time, EdChoice kept doing that survey from April, May, June, July. And I put into the chat the most recent stats that I saw on this from EdChoice, nationally representative survey from July. It was, the ratio was about the same, about 2.4 times more likely to say that they were more favorable than they were to say that they were less favorable. But in July, it spiked to being the families were about 5 times as likely to say that they had more favorable views of homeschooling than they were to say that they had less favorable views of homeschooling. So over time, it got even better. It could have gone the opposite direction if families started to figure out that they didn't like homeschooling for whatever reason. But it seems like the more experience that families are getting with homeschooling, the better and better it's getting, and the more that they're liking it. And similarly, in July, if you look at on Google, you can go to a website called Google Trends. If you just go into Google and type in Google Trends, if you type in homeschool or homeschool with a space or without a space, in the United States at least, the public interest in the term homeschooling or homeschool reached an all-time high in March when all the schools started to close, but then even a higher interest, an all-time high in July, when families started to figure out, well, my schools are opening in so many places. I think the United States was a lot worse than a lot of other countries in that the traditional public school system just didn't respond to the needs of families, and the teachers unions fought really hard to keep the schools closed. And so families really didn't have a lot of other options. So we saw a huge spike in homeschooling, as Kerry said, with the Gallup poll. They estimated that there's going to be about a 7 percentage point drop in the proportion of students who are enrolled in the traditional public schools, or what some people call the government-run schools in the United States. And applying that to the total number of students we have in the public school system to this year, that would be roughly about a 3.5 million student reduction from traditional public schools in the United States. And they also estimated about a doubling of homeschooled students in that survey as well on a national basis. So pretty optimistic about when it comes to the numbers, looking at surveys like this, but then also looking at actual public school enrollments. We've seen drops everywhere that numbers have come out. For example, in Texas, they estimate about a 4% reduction in public school enrollment this year. In Arizona, about a 5% reduction. In Manchester, New Hampshire, the live free or die state, about a 9% reduction in public school enrollments. In Wisconsin, a 3% reduction. On average, it tends to be about 3 to 5% reductions that we're seeing everywhere. Who knows, maybe it'll come up to that 7% that was estimated by Gallup, because people can still make decisions to unenroll their children. There's a lot of reasons why people are unenrolling their children. Don't get me wrong. One of the reasons is obvious, that families were enrolled in the public schools and the public schools just didn't open their doors. And so families saw homeschooling as a good option just in the meantime. Another reason could be that families other reasons could be more long-term in nature. For example, the remote learning was a huge disaster in the public schools all across the nation in the United States. A lot of the times people couldn't even log in. They couldn't get the systems right. And then just having the child sit in front of a Zoom screen for hours and hours a day was just getting exhausting for so many families. But another thing is, and this kind of hints at what Angela was talking about, is that families, another unintended consequence of going remote was that families got to see what happened in the learning environment for their children. And families were seeing that there was a lot of political indoctrination going on in their schools. For example, on Twitter, one Philadelphia-based educator in the public school system, his name was Matthew Kay, he posted right before the virtual learning started that he was really worried that families were going to see what was going on in the classroom, and that families were going to see that that they were going to interrupt his social justice type of curriculum. And he pointed out that he was especially concerned about what conservative parents would have to say about what was going on in the classroom. So obviously, a lot of parents saw this as a red flag that, in the first place, an educator shouldn't be trying to hide anything from children's parents. So parents saw that as a red flag. And then secondly, particularly conservative parents were upset about this. And so parents started to look deeply into what was going on into the classroom. And because families started to figure out what was going on in the classroom, I think that they'll continue to homeschool just based on their beliefs and their values. I also think that this is going to be a long-term trend based on a Civis Analytics poll, a nationally representative survey in the United States. They found that a large number of families have already switched to different schooling environments because of the reopening decisions of the schools, but they also took it a step further in this poll and asked families, will they continue to homeschool even after the schools or to stay in their new sector after the schools reopened in person. And about 1 in every 5, about 17% of the respondents said that even if their traditional public schools or their private school buildings or their charter schools reopen with in-person instruction, and even if they believe that it's safe to go back, and even if they're not worried about the virus anymore, they would still stay in the current sector. So that gives me some hope that this isn't just a short-term blip on the timeline, that a lot of the families are going to, and look, this number could increase after more and more people figure out that they have the ability to homeschool their children. Another thing is this emergence of pandemic pods, and Kerry McDonald already talked a little bit about this, but this is kind of the idea of the one-room schoolhouse that's re-envisioned, the micro school. Some people kind of think of this as homeschool co-op, where families are getting together to economize and share resources to make home-based education more doable. And so we had a Facebook group in the United States called Pandemic Pods that started in the San Francisco Bay Area, and just in a couple of months, they went from obviously 0 members in that private group to over 40,000 members, which gives me another indication that a lot of families are seeking out these alternative options, and they're seeing it as a viable option and an option that they may continue to do in the long term. Kerry also pointed out that there's a lot of entrepreneurial activity going around, especially with micro schools. I actually got into a Twitter engagement with at Jason. It's just at Jason. He's actually a big Silicon Valley investor. I think he did a lot of the initial investments in Uber, but he had tweeted out actually that he was thinking about starting a micro school as well. So we could even see on just social media channels that there was big investors putting the feelers out on doing these, on providing these kind of services when the government has fallen short for so many families. There was a lot of pushback because a lot of families were saying, oh, you're trying to profit off of this time. But then a lot of people rightly pushed back on the pushback by saying, no, there's a need here. He's trying to help families in need by providing a service. And he's even giving scholarships to disadvantaged families to be able to attend this micro school that he's thinking about putting together. So I think the pandemic pod idea is a great idea. As Kerry pointed out, that it could be good for teachers too. Just think about it. If we had a school choice mechanism where in the United States, we spend over $15,000 per child per year on a national basis on average. If you got 10 students together in a household, that's over, that's about $150,000 in revenues. It obviously wouldn't all go to the teachers, but if you can minimize the overhead costs, a lot of that money could go to teachers, and they could actually make more than what they were making in the traditional public school system with a class size of only 10 students relative to the 20 or 30 or 40 student class sizes you can see often in the traditional public school system. And teachers could have more autonomy with this type of setup by getting away from the regulations that are involved in the traditional public school system. And we also, I've seen anecdotes of teachers switching into the micro school environment as well. For example, Washington Post wrote about a teacher in New Jersey that had been in the traditional system for about 2 decades. And that was they were making a salary of about, I want to say $80,000 or $90,000 a year. And they decided to make the switch out of the traditional public school system after 2 decades of being in that system to start full-time micro schooling privately for, I think, 5 to 10 students in a household. So that just goes to show you that could be a good thing for employees in the system as well, in addition to the families. In addition to that Pandemic Pods group that we saw getting 40,000 members, we also saw a group called Learn Everywhere pop up on Facebook that got about 14,000 members together in a very short amount of time. And this was a lot of families coming together spontaneously to share resources on homeschooling and to share tips for homeschooling. So I thought that was a great thing to see as well. And then the biggest thing that I see is that, one, as a result of all this, families are pushing for, families are re-envisioning the factory model of schooling and starting to have more confidence in their ability to homeschool their own children in their own households. And they're just seeing a lot of the benefits of home-based education, that the kids are less stressed out, their children are learning more in a fraction of the time, and they're more engaged and they're happier. But then they're also re-envisioning the way that we structure education funding. At least in the United States, you live in a particular residence and your child's education dollars go to a residentially assigned government-run school, regardless of how well that school meets your child's needs and regardless of whether you're even sending your child to that school. So if you send your child to a private school or if you homeschool, the government-run institution still gets your child's education dollars without even providing your child with that education. So I think a lot of families are starting to realize that it doesn't make a lot of sense that the public schools aren't even opening, but it's still getting your child's education dollars, and you're having to do a lot of the work when it comes to home-based education, or when you're having to pay out of pocket and scrape by to try to pay for a private school. School tuition and fees. So to their household to a which could be used to cover home-based education and other private forms of education. And the latest survey on this found a 10 percentage point uptick in support for education savings accounts and other school choice type mechanisms. It went from 67% to 67% in April up to 77% in just a month or two ago. And then also Frank Luntz also did a survey on this, a national survey that I just saw yesterday. And he similarly found, with a survey of about 1,000 respondents across the nation in the United States, that about over 80% of parents support education savings accounts, which is similar to that 77% result from the Real Clear Opinion survey. A lot of homeschool people in the community might have mixed feelings about things like school choice or funding the student directly instead of the government-run institution. I would argue that we should welcome these type of mechanisms because it could increase the amount of homeschoolers in the system. We've already seen a lot of homeschoolers switch because of the pandemic. If we had school choice and the money following the child, it would be more economically feasible for more people, and you'd have an even bigger tent, and you'd have a much stronger political power to defend against calls for regulation. And then if you can have even more people involved in the movement, this would allow for more of society to see homeschooling as more mainstream. And then again, as a result of that, you'll see less calls for regulation if homeschooling is viewed as more of a normal thing. That's just another result of the pandemic that I think is a silver lining, that since people have all test-driven homeschool in one form or another, or home-based education at least, people will become more accepting of homeschooling. And that's what we're kind of seeing in those EdChoice polls as well over time. And then also, I think these types of initiatives are a good idea because they're voluntary. Most people in the homeschooling movement understand that my family should be able to make cost-benefit decisions for my own children, and then other families should be able to make their own cost-benefit decisions. And so if you don't, if the regulations are too much for your family when it comes to an education savings account, you should absolutely have that right to say, nope, I don't want those regulations. It's not worth the benefits of the monetary benefits. But then other families should be able to have that same choice in front of them. And so you shouldn't try to stop other families from making that decision for their own situation. And I think most people can get on board with that voluntary aspect of these types of education savings accounts programs. I think that's about it. We should open it up to questions because I've gone over on my time by a couple of minutes, but I want to thank Kerry for the the excellent remarks, and Angela, although she's not on anymore, I really enjoyed her talk as well. And Gerald, thanks for the introductions. And I think actually Michael Donnelly might have some words before Q&A, unless he wants to jump into that. But
thank you, Corey. We so much appreciate your perspective from a research perspective, being able to objectively look at us, look at our movement, look at the impacts and the things that are happening, and we thank you for that insight. I do believe that my good friend Mike Donnelly might have some comments. We do have time and time before the plenary session that starts in an hour, so we don't need to feel rushed. For those of you that don't know Mike, Mike is the Global Outreach Director with HSLDA in the United States and is the Secretary of the Global Home Education Exchange, and is a great friend, homeschool dad, and untiring champion and an advocate for freedom around the world. And I don't say that lightly, because I really know that Mike has a heart for advancing freedom, but doing it in a way that he is considered a friend and a colleague of so many people around the world, that through his ways of developing relationships and connections with people is helping change the world and the movement. So, Mike, I know that you have a perspective on the impacts of this pandemic on education policy and home education, and would love to hear from you and your perspective.
Thank you, Gerald. What a privilege it is to share a Zoom platform with my good friends, Dr. Corey DeAngelis, Dr. Corey, and Kerry, my dear.
I'm not a medical doctor. I'm like Dr. Jill Biden.
You're a PhD, right? You got a PhD, don't you? So that means you're a doctor, dude. Anyway, Gerald, thank you for that kind introduction, but I have to point out that I'm not an untiring advocate. I get tired. In fact, after this week, it's been a long week. It's been an amazing conference so far. Today is just the beginning of our busiest day of the conference, and I just want to express my appreciation for the people who have worked so hard and who've gotten up at very early hours for them, as we've been going from 4 a.m. until 10 p.m. Eastern time, trying to capture attention from everyone all over the world. And so my assistant Trudy, who is a program manager here for our global outreach, thanks Trudy, and Gerald, who's been chairing the proceedings, and all of our board members from all over the world. It's been a great team effort, and I really appreciate their contributions. At HSLDA, my job, I wear a number of hats, and yes, I do have the privilege of doing global outreach and interacting with so many interesting people from all over the world and so many different walks of life, researchers and policymakers and homeschooling organization leaders. It's really incredible. I think I've logged 500,000 miles in the 10 years that I've been at HSLDA, traveled to about 30 different countries, and met with so many interesting, lovely people. And you know, what I've seen as I've done that is that people are really not that different when you go from one country to the other. I mean, there are a lot of really great differences, like the food, for example. You know, the food is different. That's really awesome. You know, and the traditions can be different, which is very interesting. And the cultural communication aspects are different. You know, like nodding your head in one country might mean yes, and shaking your head mean no, which is like hard to grasp as a Westerner. And so people are different, but at the core, we share so much. We share so many things, and at the heart of families is the love of children. You know, we have children, and they're a blessing. And we want to raise our children and educate them and bring them up in the best way possible for them. And that's what homeschooling is really about. And so when we're talking here about a response to the pandemic, and so when all of a sudden, I mean, it wasn't really all of a sudden, it was like a train wreck in slow motion, really, when you think about it, because you saw it sort of coming. I mean, I remember, you know, we were hearing about this virus in January, and I was traveling. I was in Africa in January, and I was traveling around and on a plane. And the last time I was on a plane was in March, and still things were kind of like, yeah, okay, there's this virus, okay, you know, whatever. And all of a sudden, bam! Here in the U.S., it was a crashing halt, and things got very strange. And schools were closing like overnight. Overnight, suddenly schools were closing. They were just reacting, and people were scrambling because the schools were closed, and all of a sudden, and they were home, and everybody was together, which is very unusual in America because we're like, you know, busy. Americans are very busy people doing lots of things all the time in their own way. And all of a sudden we're stuck in our houses and not sending our kids to school and trying to balance work and education. And we're like, well, this will be for a couple of weeks, maybe a month. And all of a sudden it just kept on rolling and rolling and rolling and rolling. And we realized this is going to go on for a while. And the school said, okay, we can do this. We got technology. And they started, you know, beaming technology into people's homes. And you know, people had multiple teachers emailing them. And, you know, and the schools were doing, you know, they were doing the best they could. I mean, I'm sure, you know, they're trying to manage. And for homeschoolers, you know, probably the biggest impact on us was, okay, we're just not going to do co-op this week for, you know, however long, you know, and get together with other people. You know, education continued pretty much, not exactly the same as Kerry pointed out, but, you know, we are social people, contrary to the myths of, you know, the lore that homeschoolers are antisocial or socially isolated. Totally untrue. Not at all. Probably more social than other groups. But at any rate, so that was a big impact for the homeschooling community. But parents now, the public school parents, you know, they were suddenly schooling at home and trying to figure this out. And so, you know, as an attorney at HSLDA, the other thing that I do is I answer calls from parents who have questions about homeschooling and who are trying to figure out, how do we comply with the law? How do we do this? And these were the questions that parents were asking, and those are the questions that that we answer. They were asking questions like, okay, so my kids are home. Am I homeschooling? Not necessarily, right? Because if you're still enrolled in the public school, that's not really homeschooling. Or I'm just trying to survive. What's the bare minimum that I can do to just get by? How can I be both my child's parent and teacher? Okay, if I'm not going to do the public school, and I'm going to punch out of that because a lot of people were not satisfied with how that was going, because they had 2 or 3 kids and they were dealing with 6 teachers and 3 different technology platforms. And they're like, forget it. This is too frustrating. I'm not going to do this anymore. And they stopped doing it, but they still had to do something. And they're like, well, what do we do? Do I copy the school schedule at home? Some people were like, how on earth can I do this? I can't do this. This is too much. And so they were stressed. What should I do if the school isn't giving me support or direction? Do I have to do what the school says? People were asking so many different questions, and they were trying to meet a lot of needs for their family, for their children, in this very uncertain situation. And it's still some uncertainty, although we were learning to live with this virus. It's not going away, and we're dealing with it in lots of different ways, but it's definitely having a transformative impact, which, as Angela pointed out, it's a tragic impact, and it's affected a lot of people in a very negative way. And, people have died from this virus. But at the same time, where there's a crisis, there's always an opportunity to look at how you're doing things, and you might be able to do things differently. And I hope that as a country, as a people around the world, also we will embrace the opportunity to look at maybe there's some things we can do differently. And so people are trying to figure out how to create some stability in their home. And as Corey and Kerry pointed out, some people were actually saying, this isn't too bad. Not everybody was saying that. Some people were saying things like, man, I can't wait for the schools to open up so I can send my kids back so I can get back to normal. And that's fine. Everybody's got to kind of deal with their own situation. But a lot of people were enjoying it. They were thinking, this isn't so bad. And we were encouraging them and saying, look, you know what? It's a tough time, but you can find joy in your family. You can find joy in the relationship that you can now have with your kids that you didn't have before. You can participate in the learning experience, the educational experience that you've never done before. And people were telling us, they were like, man, this is amazing. I'm teaching my child how to read. I'm watching my child learn. And they're learning more now at home in 2 hours a day than they were learning before when I was sending them to school from 6 in the morning to 4 in the afternoon. And they're stressed out and they're tired and they're getting homework sent home. And anyway, homework, I'll just, little pet peeve of mine is homework. I'm like, look, guys, we're paying taxes. We're paying you teachers to do this job. And you got our kids 10 hours a day. Can't you get the job done in 10 hours and not send the homework home? That's what I used to think. I had a child, our first child we sent to school for a short period of time. And I'm like, man, come on. I've never liked homework even when I was a student. I didn't do it. Anyway, so people figured out that you don't need to take 8 hours a day and do a school schedule at home, because that's not what homeschooling is. Homeschooling is not school at home. And so in response to this virus situation, for a lot of families, homeschooling was a new thing and a good thing. And a lot of people embraced it. It wasn't easy for everybody. A lot of people were out of work, struggling financially. Where do you get curriculum? Fortunately, the internet is available, and there's a lot of great, inexpensive curriculum available on the internet. And, as Corey and Kerry both pointed out, there's been a lot of growth in the educational area. And at HSLDA, we've seen a lot of growth as homeschooling has gone from, well, the U.S. government said about 1.8 million. That was their numbers back in 2016. And the U.S. Census has been doing surveys on a weekly basis, their Pulse survey. And their numbers are, indicating that there are anywhere from between 4 and 6 million children who are being homeschooled. So that's like 3 times growth, which fits with the numbers that Corey was talking about before with the 9% unenrollment rate from school, which, Corey, I just saw an article today from the West Virginia Gazette affirming that 9% unenrollment from West Virginia schools. And of course, you know what they say. that's going to cost the public school system $46 million, right? It's all about the money. They're focusing on the money. Anyway, maybe you can do a little tweet on that. But at any rate, so as homeschooling has grown from 4% to anywhere from 8 to 10% of the school age population in the United States, we've seen that also happening around the world. As Kerry said, anywhere from 1.3 to 1.5 billion children were not going to school. And the other thing about homeschooling, is that not everybody has access to the technology in some of the poor countries, and they don't have schools in some of these poor countries as well. So this is, the idea of involving families more in education, I think is an idea that can clearly crosses boundaries and cultures, but it cuts across all kinds of demographic variables, socioeconomic. The other interesting thing, guys, from the pulse survey that the U.S. Census has been doing is the fastest growing economic segment has been the lower income segment. Isn't that interesting? In fact, the $25,000 to $50,000 segment grew 4 times, according to the U.S. survey, as compared to maybe 2 or 3 times in the other segments. Fascinating data there. And again, this is a survey and there's a lot of margin for error, but you can get some directional ideas. And to me, I found that just to be fascinating. And it shows that homeschooling isn't something that you have to be middle class or rich to do. And can you do this as 2 working parents? Yeah, I mean, that's what people were doing. That was one of the questions. They're like, how can I do this as a working parent? I got 3 kids, I got to work. And we're like, you're at home. You can balance this. You can involve other members of your family if you want to. Homeschooling can be an extended family affair as well. There's lots of different ways to do it. And so, I think what we found is, and what I wrote about it at a couple of points in some articles that I wrote, you can find one in the Federalist. In May of this year, I predicted 10 million children homeschooling. Everybody thought I was nuts. And Corey, that was based on your 15% Facebook poll. I said, if Corey's right, that's 10 million kids. And it's not quite 10 million, but it's pretty close, a lot closer to 10 million than it is to, the 2 million that it was. So anyway, yeah, you can do this. And people were trying to figure this out. And what I think this did, as bad of a situation it is, as much as we don't like a lot of the consequences of this virus pandemic and the response to it by various institutions in our societies, at least in the US, it was a real opportunity to see the resilience and the creativity of our fellow citizens as they grappled with this and just figured out how to live life. And I'm sure that's true. And I know it's true from other countries. So I'll just finish and we can have a conversation here. But I think, what's going to happen with homeschooling? Well, we haven't seen it drop off yet. So people are continuing. I think that there are a lot of people who said, well, we'll give this remote learning a shot for a month or 2. And they did. And we saw a huge growth over the summer, kind of plateaued. And now I think we're seeing another little uptick in the growth as people are not liking how it's working, some of them. And if the schools start closing again, I think we're going to see a much larger increase. And the longer this goes on, like everybody's used to wearing masks, right? It's the new quote unquote new normal, right? Which I'm not too keen on that myself personally. I don't like that. I reject that idea. But look, I respect people who want to do that, and that's fine. We can debate the science and whatever about it. Okay. But it's like now everybody's doing it. And how, when it takes 7 days or 21 days to create a new habit. And once you create that habit, it's hard to stop a habit, right? So I think people are getting the habit of homeschooling. And so the longer they're homeschooling, guess what? The more they're going to do it and the harder it's going to be for them to stop. And why would you stop doing something that's great anyway? So I think there's a bright future for homeschooling, here in the US, but also around the world. And I think that's good. I think because homeschooling is good. It's good for kids. It's good for families. It's good for communities. It's good for countries. It's good. It's a good thing. And that's what I love about my job is that I get to spend all my professional energy in supporting a really good thing. So Gerald, back over to you. Thank you so much for giving me just a few minutes here to share Thank you all for being here. And again, to my friends, Kerry and Corey, thanks for being part of this today.
Thank you, Mike. We appreciate your comments and your insight. I know that I called you untiring, and I accept your humanity. But I would say what you do, Mike, is you hide it well with a smile. So it's great. What we'd like to do now is open up our discussion for some questions, either from our attendees. If any of you have questions, you can put them into the Q&A box, or other panelists. If you want to ask some questions and stimulate the discussion or make some further comments, please jump in. Any questions or comments that any of our panelists have right off to start things?
Yeah, it looks like Kimberly posted in the chat to all of us that she worries about government seeking more legislation on homeschooling after being overwhelmed with homeschool registrations this fall, pressure from the schools due to loss of income. I think that is a real concern, certainly with the pandemic pods. As I mentioned in my remarks, there has been increased regulation in some states of pandemic pods. What I find interesting in particular here in Massachusetts was that a lot of this regulation of these pods was being driven by parents asking for the state to provide quote unquote guidelines, which of course then turn into regulations. So I do think it is a concern as parents who are more in that kind of district school mindset switch over to homeschooling or some kind of hybrid model of homeschooling. I think Corey's right, though, that we'd rather err on the side of welcoming parents and families into homeschooling, and hopefully through that process can encourage them to be more independent, to realize that they don't need the state hand-holding, that they don't need to have regulations to do what's right for their children. But I think that, this is certainly a transition. It's definitely a challenge. And again, the great work that HSLDA does to protect homeschooling rights, I think is really important part of this whole process.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Corey.
I was going to say, I agree with Kerry that, we should welcome a big tent, and at least then we have power in numbers to defend against calls for regulation. The government can already regulate homeschoolers and other forms of private education, so we might as well get more people on our side. In Massachusetts, where Kerry's located, I think there was some regulations about if you had 5 or more people in a pandemic pod and they were unrelated, you had to register as a daycare center or something. I saw something similar in Colorado. It was either 4 or 5 or 6. It was around that number. If you hit that number, you had to register as a daycare center in Colorado as well. I don't know if there's other states that have these types of regulations, but those were the 2 that I noticed that I was kind of worried about. And hopefully there aren't more calls for regulation. I do think it, a lot of this is driven through trying to protect the status quo, because traditional public schools are funded based on enrollment counts. And Angela mentioned this in her opening remarks, and this is kind of what the audience members questioning in the chat box. We saw a lot of examples of the traditional public school system showing their face, essentially what Michael Donnelly was pointing out earlier in West Virginia. I want to see that article. I'll tweet about it after the conference. But then also the first one that I saw was in Denver public schools. The superintendent sent out a formal statement to everyone about pandemic pods. And they tried to shame parents by saying that, oh, you're contributing to segregation. And, this is a horrible, horrible thing if you're seeking out education alternatives for your own child, and placing the blame on the parents instead of placing the blame on the public school system for not reopening and not providing the services that they were always providing. So they were trying to shame parents against doing that, but they showed their face when they gave a list of bullet points of what the parents should do. The number 1 bullet point was, don't enroll your children from the public school system no matter what you do, because we're going to lose about $13,000 per child per year if you unenroll from the books. So even if you're going to homeschool, just don't unenroll your kids, showing that this is all about the money. And we saw a similar statement that came out from a school district in Virginia near me, and same kind of messaging. You know, oh, if you do the pandemic pod things, you're a bad person. And a superintendent of Alexandria City Public Schools, I want to say, it was another Virginia school district, told everybody not to take their kids out and do the pandemic pod thing. But then he disenrolled his own child out of the public school system and enrolled them into a private school nearby that did have in-person instruction. So we're seeing a lot of this everywhere.
Thanks, Corey. I know that in interacting with home education leaders in a number of places, they are, I don't say worried, but they're concerned about when the other shoe is going to drop, as the saying goes, in terms of potential regulation, because as the numbers increase, the various authorities say, well, maybe we should do something about this. And I really appreciate your comments of the big tent, the getting together, the working together to deal with those things. Here in my province, any case where there's more than two families involved and there's some kind of a teacher involved in the system, you actually fall under school regulations. So it's, it gets complicated by the regulation system that then applies if you're seen as being a non-funded private school, which is permitted and allowed, but it's another set of hoops to jump through. Another question that's come up is.
Hey, Gerald, let me.
I'm just going to give you another. I'm going to give you another question, Mike, to deal with, and that's.
Oh, okay.
In addition to this, sort of the regulation and the impacts question, it's the question of is there any feedback about places other than the U.S. or Canada? What's happening in other places in the world for numbers? And I'll ask you to speak to that, and then Corey and Kerry can jump in on that as well. But
I want to share my screen. I want to share one of the things we do at HSLDA is we track legislation, and of course, Corey, I completely agree. Every homeschooler should join HSLDA so that we can be powerful in our advocacy, which we are. Our enemies, tremble in their boots when they, hear the term HSLDA, because, as Elizabeth Bartholet says, we're so aggressive and brutal in our lobbying. That's a little poke at Elizabeth Bartholet, who wrote an article in the Arizona Law Review who wants to ban homeschooling, and she blames HSLDA for all the freedom that we have as homeschoolers, which we'll take that blame. We'll happily accept responsibility, although we can't take credit, frankly, because it's been a 20-year fight, and it was a monumental engagement of parents and organizations and all of our communities working together at the local state level to advance homeschool freedom. But you see here, if you are interested in legislation, at HSLDA, we track 24 issue areas across all 50 states, and we read hundreds and in some cases thousands of bills a year. And you can see here, homeschool laws is right here. There are homeschool laws: COVID-19, child protection, parental rights, immunization, kindergarten, early childhood, driver's education, labor laws, all kinds of different things. We look at things that we think our members and the homeschool community would be interested in. So this is a web page that you want to bookmark, and it's available free. It's public information. Anybody can look at it. What we're seeing right now, we haven't seen any specific efforts to restrict homeschooling in the United States because of a response to the unenrollments. What I am seeing is the school systems trying to protect their funding by asking legislatures to freeze enrollment numbers. So in Minnesota, for example, let's see if I can bring that up. I'll just show you how this thing works. Hopefully it will work. Let's see if I'm even tracking that bill yet. I just saw a bill come through. I think it was, I haven't put this one on our bill screen yet. It's HF4, which is a proposal to freeze enrollment from last year's numbers for this year. So even, they just want to keep the money. They want to keep it the same. They have less students and they want to keep the money. So that's what we're seeing. I've also seen in a couple of states a few proposals to, do public funding of what they call parent-directed home-based learning, and it would be a form of publicly funded homeschooling, basically, which, we're not too keen on that. Corey, you mentioned the idea of ESAs, and we agree is as long as, you keep the two things separate so that people can forego the money and not additional regulations that may come with those ESAs, that could be a helpful thing for some people. But anyway, that's what we're seeing. We're not seeing any direct attacks on homeschooling right now in the United States, although I know a lot of people are concerned about that. We're concerned about it. We're watching very carefully. We have relationships with legislators and other organizations who also have policy watchers and lobbyists on the ground in all 50 states. We work with a number of organizations who hear things. For example, the American Legislative Exchange Council or Americans for Prosperity, Stand Together organizations, and different public policy oriented organizations who are listening and trying to figure out what's going on in the minds of legislators. So we're watching, and just know that we're watching, and we will act and let you know if we see something that needs to be acted on. Globally, right now, ground zero for homeschooling freedom threat is France, and it's not really it's not a reaction to the pandemic. Actually, it's a reaction to something else. France has been dealing with their own issues, cultural issues regarding immigrants and immigration and religious issues that they have, and it's been going on for decades, maybe even centuries in France, this debate that they have there over secular versus religious. And anyway, President Macron of France has proposed a ban, basically a ban on homeschooling because of what he perceives to be the threat of Islamic separatism. And so he's basically throwing anything that could be outside the state into this plan of his to clamp down on society because he's afraid of Islamic separatism. And I don't make any comments on that. I don't know that it's that big of an issue, but I do know that has nothing to do with homeschooling. And that's what we're saying. And that's what advocates in France are saying is like, look, deal with that issue if you want to, but it's nothing to do with homeschooling. And you shouldn't be trying to restrict homeschooling because of that. Other than that, there hasn't really been a lot of other threat to homeschooling directly related to the pandemic. And as it relates to growth in other countries, we have definitely seen significant growth in other countries. Anywhere from 50 to 100% growth is what's being reported by the context we have on the ground in other countries. So it's growing everywhere, Gerald.
Thanks, Mike. Appreciate that. Any other comments on this area of discussion by other panelists, Kerry or Corey?
Yeah, I just add that I think I mentioned this in my remarks, but I'll reinforce it that, of course, here in Massachusetts is one of the states that's tried to regulate these pandemic pods a little bit more. But I think it's, again, important to note that these regulations apply to children that are still enrolled in a school and that are doing school at home, but are still considered an enrolled student. So even here, where we see more of these pandemic pod regulations, they haven't affected homeschooling. I think we still need to be vigilant. Certainly, if the numbers stay high, we could see a possibility for that, particularly if it starts to hit districts' pocketbooks. But for now, again, if you are choosing to be an independent homeschooler and removing your child officially from the district, then you still have that freedom and that flexibility, and we want to make sure that continues to be preserved even as homeschooling numbers grow. I think another point, and Mike brought this up in his talk, which is that it's interesting to see the connection or correlation between the states that are kind of trying to regulate pandemic pods or who may be sending signals of support or discouragement of homeschooling or pandemic pods. I think Mike mentioned New Hampshire, where there's been a significant decline in public school enrollment and an associated uptick in homeschooling numbers. And that state, particularly their Commissioner of Education, Frank Edelblut, has been very supportive of homeschooling. He himself homeschooled his children and is really welcoming of these pods and of homeschoolers. And I think that is also then indicative of the numbers that we're seeing rising there. So, there is a lot of I think, again, a lot of correlation between the support of states for these kinds of alternatives to school and regulations and numbers of families choosing this.
Cool, Kerry.
Go ahead, Corey.
I guess
jump
a
on in.
follow-up I want to ask Kerry. So if you're that regulation with 4 to 5 kids in a household or whatever, that's only if you're enrolled in the public school. Is that what you were saying? If so,
Yeah.
that's great.
Well, the way the regulation was written for Massachusetts was if you're enrolled in a public or private school. So they did include private schools in that. Of course, the state
but if you're just homeschooling,
currently does have the capacity to regulate private schools as well, but homeschoolers, were not explicitly included in that.
Okay. Well, I wanted to hit on Vanya's question. Is there anywhere in the U.S. where homeschooling families receive government funds? Is that something to be desired? I know of 2 places. You guys might be able to add, but California, at least from what I've read about, has, if you're enrolled in a virtual charter school and you do home-based education through the virtual charter school, you can get like $2,000 a year. But I don't know if a lot of people on this call would define that as homeschooling, since you're enrolled in the government essentially program, the virtual charter school program. And then also in Alaska, this is something I recently found out, they have like I want to say like 20 different programs where they fund homeschoolers directly, but maybe Mike knows more about those programs and if they're less regulated than the California program that requires you to be enrolled in a virtual charter school. But those are the only 2 places where I know they fund students directly. And I don't know the extent of the regulations in those places. I think it's better than not having the option on the table. But again, if it's regulated, homeschool families should be concerned about that, and they should rightfully, think about that when they're making that decision to enroll in those types of programs or not.
Yeah, you're right on, Corey. California, we would not consider that homeschooling in California because although the home is the base of instruction, you're enrolled in a public school, and so you're under the public school's supervision, although you have a lot of flexibility. However, there has been some concern among the group of people who do that the legislature is aware of it and is not happy about it, and that could be targeted for some kind of further action. And Alaska, yes, Alaska does fund homeschooling. I mean, Alaska has lots of money to fund lots of different things. There's a very small population up there. And when you look globally, Canada, there are some provinces where homeschool families receive direct government funding. Also, Taiwan is a country where there is direct government funding. So there are some countries where there is direct government funding. An interesting comparative study across countries would be looking at, what countries do any kind of direct funding. And it would also be interesting to kind of look at the regulatory connections that go along with that, if there are any. And, those kinds of studies are very difficult to do, because the big concern that, we have at HSLDA with government funding is that, as some of you have probably heard, with government shekels come government shackles. And they can anyway. And although the homeschool community has demonstrated its ability to fend off any additional regulations, it's very hard to argue against regulations when you're getting public money. And so that's why we take a very strong position on keeping any kind of government funding out of private education. So as you talked about the ESA proposals where the state would actually put some amount of money based on a percentage of per pupil funding as a formula into an account for a child, which the parents could then direct. That's kind of the most common ESA proposal. It has been met with a lot of resistance. There are a couple of states that have done that. It's been proposed in other states. And like any legislative proposal, it takes time for them to progress. Sometimes they're successful, sometimes they're not. The ones that have been successful, Arizona, I think, is the one that has the most robust and free, if you want to call it free, freely available. And there, my understanding is that only about 20% of the people who use the money use it to homeschool, so-called homeschool. And it is under a different category of student. So in Arizona, you can choose to do the ESA. If you do, you're expressly not considered a homeschool student. And in Arizona, there's a very very freely available way to homeschool. You just file a notice of intent and you're homeschooling.
Another place, Michael, I should have mentioned this, is New Hampshire. New Hampshire has a tax credit scholarship program, which is kind of good from the regulatory standpoint because it's privately funded. you have people donating to a scholarship granting organization. The funds never come into the tax collector's hands. So at least in the US, that's still defined as private dollars. And families go to that scholarship granting organization. They can use those funds for private school, but they could also use it for homeschooling expenses. Most tax credit scholarship programs don't allow you to use it for homeschooling, but this is the only one in the US that allows you to use it for homeschooling expenses. And
well, you're right, Corey. HSLDA was involved in defending that because we believe that's a good approach. We want to encourage private action, right? De Tocqueville's, civil society argument that, we should be doing that. In fact, I would encourage folks to read an article written by my colleague, Jim Mason, called The Civic Virtue of Private Home Education, which is a great article and explains the philosophy of why we want to be very careful about allowing government money to come into our private lives in any way, shape, or form, not just in home education. And I know that Kerry and Corey, as libertarian-oriented people, I think you would agree with that. We want to be very careful. And there's an equity argument in terms of how we fund public education and the common good. And, that's a great philosophical argument to have. But the civic value of private home education is a great article I would encourage folks to read. And we can do this privately. We're okay with tax credit programs. Personally, myself, taxes, I'm a Van Hayek kind of fan. I'm like, taxation is theft. That's my view. Okay, we need to pay taxes for fire and police, that kind of thing. All right, whatever. But I'm kind of more along those lines. So any way we can allow people to keep more of their money to choose to do what they think is best for them, that's better. And that's, the tax credit approach is kind of along those lines. The scholarship granting organizations is a really good approach. So we fully support that and think that's the way to go.
Hey, we could privatize the police and the fire department too. Check out my article on police choice. You can give police vouchers, but no, police vouchers. But another thing is another approach, instead of having the tax credit scholarship, is just getting a tax deduction, right? Don't take my money from me in the first place if I homeschool my children. That way there's no funding being taken from any source, private or public. It's just, let me keep my money. And I think that's another great way to avoid regulations, but there's not that many of those programs that exist. And I think it's
only about
harder
six states. About 6 states in the U.S. have a tax credit or tax deduction. The difference is important because a tax deduction actually is treated differently than a tax credit. A tax credit program, the Supreme Court has said that's your money, and the government is basically saying, okay, we're allowing a credit against the tax owed, and that's kind of your money. Whereas a tax deduction is you're allowed to reduce your taxable income for certain allowable expenditures, right? And so there, the government gets to define what are those allowable expenditures, as opposed to saying, and we're getting into the weeds here on tax policy, but it's important because it makes a difference which way you go. We support tax credits, and again, tax credits for organizations or individuals that contribute to private foundations for educational purposes. Great idea. Also allowing people a broad-based educational tax credit, kind of like the child tax credit that we have at the federal level. Okay, that's fine. Again, anything that allows people to keep more of their money, to choose to do it, to use it for what they think is best for their family is a good thing in my view.
It's interesting how in virtually everybody's comments in our session today, there's been a reference to it's about the money, that there is a significant fiscal driver in the decisions, in the policies, in the regulations, in the interests of those that have their fingers into home education, and I've seen that over and over again in Canada and in other parts of the world, but particularly in Canada, as we're seeing these pandemic homeschoolers, the people that are new to these things, we're seeing more of a call for saying we need fairness. What about us? We pay taxes. Why shouldn't we get help as well? And I can't dispute the reality that there are expenses involved because home education costs. But as Mike has said, in a number of parts of Canada, particularly the province of Alberta, there has been a government funding of home education programs, and there was no option until recently. Parents in Alberta recently had the option that they lobbied hard to be able to opt out of that. To be able to go with a notification-only system that didn't involve any money. And that was sort of the departure. They didn't lobby for money, they lobbied to get out of money. and they were successful in doing that because the questions and the pressure were so strong under a previous administration that it was going to very much restrict home education. So, Vanya, your question, is that something to be desired to get money? Yeah, I think it's desired by many parents because they struggle with the finances that are involved. Is it desired for a long term? The question is, what's your freedom worth? And how much are you prepared to invest in that? And it becomes a question of policy over the longer term, and it's a significant one, as has been raised by each one of the panelists here today. I think that we've dealt with the majority of the questions. There's lots of questions. Kathleen Mons has got a number of questions about the whole area of funding and those things, and I think we've talked about it a fair bit. But there's certainly still an area of research interest and policy interest surrounding those monies that I think that there's opportunities to be able to pursue further. I'm just going to ask each one of our panelists if they have any closing comments. We're getting close to the time of needing to move on to our plenary discussion. So just any closing comments, Kerry, from your perspective?
Yeah, I would just, I think, reinforce some of the content that's already been touched upon, particularly as it relates to education savings accounts or some other school choice mechanisms. Certainly the equity issue was something that came up a lot, particularly in sort of national newspaper articles about pandemic pods and the ways in which families were creatively dealing with the pandemic. And that's where, of course, education savings accounts, tax credit scholarships, and other kinds of school choice mechanisms can make these options more accessible to more families. But I think Mike's point, and it was reiterated in the Education Week's article this week about who's choosing homeschooling, it is interesting to find that it looked like a large number of these new homeschoolers are lower income families who presumably are not actually getting access currently to any kind of school choice mechanism. And so I think, you know, the articles, especially the New York Times and Washington Post, some of these articles that came out saying, oh, you know, it's only privileged families, only high income affluent families who are able to take advantage of these schooling alternatives. And the data simply don't show that to be true. So that's a hopeful sign. And again, if we expand these choice options, even more families may be able to find the best education for their child, which of course is at the end of the day, the most important thing of all of this.
Kerry, thank you. Corey?
Yeah, I feel really optimistic about all of this. I mean, the pandemic has been a horrible thing for millions and millions of people, you know, billions of people around the world. But the one silver lining is, and I believe that people are re-envisioning the factory model of schooling, and a lot of people are going to prefer homeschooling. And I think this is going to last for a very long time. And I think that's great for educational freedom. And I think it's good for society as a whole to get back to home-based education. Look, a lot of people at the beginning of this said homeschooling was an experiment. To which I respond, homeschooling is not the experiment. People have been educating their children in households for thousands and thousands of years. Factory schooling is the experiment, and at this time, that experiment is in trouble.
Thanks, Corey. Mike?
Thank you, Gerald. I just want to thank Kerry and Corey for their participation in our conference this week and for their work. It's just a privilege to be on the panel with both of you, and I thank you. And Gerald, thank you for your great moderating this morning. And I want to encourage the attendees here, head on over to the closing plenary here. It'll be very interesting.
Thanks, Mike. And as we close, I also want to add my thanks to our panel, Kerry, Corey, Angela, and Mike. It's been great. I want to thank all the attendees for coming, and just remind everyone that the session is recorded, along with the chat features are being recorded and will be captured. To learn more about GHEX and to support our mission, please visit our website, ghx.world. Home education is a global movement and a global solution, and we'll be talking about that in particular as a focus in our plenary session coming up in just a few minutes. I want to thank you all for being part of this session, home education, a solution, an education solution in the pandemic. So thank you all, and we'll end this session, and thanks for coming.